Okay, thank you, Derek, for giving me the opportunity to come along and talk this evening. I'm going to hopefully share my screen. That should be, hopefully you can see the intro slide there. If you if if you can't, Chris, can you let me know? So this evening I'm going to talk about the experiences of British frontline soldiers in what is one of Britain's really forgotten campaigns of the First World War in Macedonia. So we're looking at what is today northern Greece and North Macedonia, which used to be part of Serbia at the time. And we're looking at the British Salonika Force and the campaign between 1915 and 1918. As this is very much a sideshow of the First World War, and normally in a general history of the First World War might get a couple of pages if it's lucky, I'll just sort of recap on why British soldiers were in that campaign. So this is a map of the campaign area, mainly showing the British sector. If you look about halfway across the map, you hopefully can see the River Vardar, and the British front from sort of 1917 onwards ran from the Vardar River round to the east to the mouth of the River Struma. But why were we there? Why were we in the Balkans? Well, we begin to land troops in Salonika in then neutral Greece on the 5th of October 1915. And one British division, that's 10th Irish Division, and two French divisions are the first troops to arrive. Now these men have got little idea that they're committing themselves to a 3-year campaign in what was then a pretty obscure corner of Europe, about which few of them knew anything. Initially, what they're there to do is to try to prevent Bulgaria. So it's basically a deterrent against Bulgaria joining the pending Austro-Hungarian German attack on Serbia. So we get to sort of September 1915. The Gallipoli campaign is still on. The Germans need a rail route across Europe to get munitions to the Turkish army at Gallipoli. And unfortunately, the Austrians in 1914 mess up the invasion of Serbia not once but 3 times. Serbia is still standing there. And with Bulgaria and Romania neutral, the Germans can't have uninterrupted rail route across Europe. So the idea is that if the Germans mastermind the invasion of Serbia and bringing the Bulgarians into the war, then there is a rail route to an uninterrupted rail route to Turkey. Now, with Bulgaria, you see that Bulgaria in 1914, 1915 is sort of sitting on the fence, deciding which side it's going to join in the First World War, or whether she'll remain neutral, of course. Before the First World War, 1912, 1913, you have 2 Balkan Wars. In the First Balkan War, the Greeks, Serbians, Bulgarians, Montenegrins get together and defeat the Ottoman army in the Balkans and more or less push the Turks out of Europe. A few months later, they fall out amongst the spoils, perhaps unsurprisingly, amongst Balkan nations, and the Bulgarians then launch an attack on Serbia and get very heavily defeated because the Greeks, the Romanians, and even the Turks come in against the Bulgarians. So the Bulgarians lose extra territory. They haven't gained what they thought they should have done in the First Balkan War, and they lose more territory in the Second Balkan War. So they're sort of looking to see who will potentially give them this territory. And of course, the Allies, it's very difficult because the land they really want is now in Serbia. So it's very difficult for the Allies. They do try to persuade the Serbians to give this territory over, but of course they don't. So the Germans basically say, well, if you join us in an attack on Serbia, you can have that territory and you can have more if you want. So that's the position we're in. So the Bulgarians are really going to come in on this on the Central Powers side. The British and French are invited to land by the Greeks, the Greek government under Venizelos. He's a prime minister at the time. He's very pro-Allied. And the Greeks have a defence pact with Serbia where they should be sending about 150,000 men to help the Serbians if they're attacked, but they don't do that. So the idea is that the Allied force is going to be a stand-in for that. The French are very gung-ho and rush their troops off into southern Serbia. The British are a lot more circumspect about this. They don't really want to be there. And when they land in early October, the big problem is the Greek government is split. There is now what is called the national schism within Greece. Venizelos has fallen from power, and power now is in the hands of King Constantine and people that support him. And he really wants to stay neutral. He tends towards the Central Powers. I mean, his wife is the sister of the Kaiser, and he thinks the Germans are potentially going to win the war. So he's very anti-Allied, but he realizes he can't force these Allied troops out of Greece at the time because it might force Greece into war against the Allied powers, and he doesn't want that. So the Allied force is there, but under sufferance with a potentially hostile Greek army in its rear. So it's very, very difficult. The Allied forces, if you can see on the map, the green arrows, this shows the Bulgarian attack. After Serbia is defeated, and the Serbian army has retreated to Albania and has been evacuated to the city, to the island of Corfu. They will return in 1916 as part of the Allied army at Salonika. But after the Serbian army has withdrawn, the Bulgarians turn their attention to the French and the British and attack them in southern Serbia, push them back into Greece, and they're forced back onto Salonika. Now, at this point, the British are very keen on getting the hell out of the Balkans, but all the other Allied nations, the Russians, the Italians, obviously the Serbians and the French are all keen to stay in the Balkans. So we're basically stuck there as part of this coalition, and we have to defend. Salonika. It's the only port where we can bring in reinforcements and supplies, and it's the only port where we can get everybody out quickly if we need to do so. So you can see here it says down near Salonika, you can see there is a fortified line. It's called the bird cage. I'll talk more about that later, but that's where the Allies stay. It's far enough north to, if the Bulgarians did come down, it's far enough north to stop any artillery bombardment of the harbour of Salonika. So it was a vital point to hold on to. Now, because the British aren't very keen on this expedition, overall command goes to the French. So the French overall commander sort of trumps everybody else. Although, as usual with British commanders, as with Haig in France, he does have recourse back to the British government to counter any directives he might get from the French, which he doesn't agree with. So he does have a potential get-out clause. However, he is always pressured by London to be seen to be supporting his French allies. So if we look at the British force, it's about 228,000 men. Now, if you think of the British Army at the time, that's relatively small, but it's a pretty big force if you think of the size of the British Army of today. So this is a pretty large force. It's about 6 divisions in 2 corps, 12th Corps and 16th Corps. The troops are a mixture of regulars, territorials, and new army volunteer service battalions, and they're drawn from all over the British Isles and Ireland. Mounted troops, that's yeomanry cavalry, that's territorial cavalry, and cyclist units, and they're supported by Royal Engineers, British, Maltese, and Macedonian Labour battalions, obviously the Army Service Corps, Indian and Macedonian muleteer units, Royal Army Medical Corps, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand medical formations, and volunteer medical staff such as the Scottish Women's Hospital. In terms of air support, they have from late 1916, they have 2 squadrons of the RFC, that's 17 and 47. There are some Royal Naval Air Service aircraft based in the Aegean, which are available from time to time. And there's also a kite balloon section, which will put up observation kite balloons when needed as well. Now, the one area where the BSF, British Salonika Force, is always weak is in artillery. Throughout the campaign, the Corps would go out for more guns, especially howitzers, which are very, very useful in the broken sort of terrain of Macedonia. However, because of the very low priority placed on the campaign by the War Office in London, really anything that arrives is really too little, too late. And if you look in terms of troops, from 1917, the BSF is seen as not a war-winning army. And if we want to do things away from the Western Front, Palestine becomes, from 1917, the place potentially for a major breakthrough. So it becomes, from mid-1917, Salonika, a place potentially to take troops to reinforce either Palestine or the Western Front. And troops will go, 2 divisions go to Palestine in 1917. And then after the German spring offensives in 1918, 12 battalions of infantry get taken from Salonika and sent back to France. So really, it's always going to be somewhere that gets stripped out of resources. And in fact, if you can look in terms of artillery, you can tell how low in the pecking order they are, because General Milne, the commander in Salonika, asked for some 8-inch howitzers in March 1917, and he gets 1 4-gun battery in January 1918. So it takes him almost a year to just get 4 heavy pieces of artillery. So you can see they're very, very low in the priority scale of the War Office. So what about the arrival of the troops? Well, initially, everybody arrived by troop ship. So initially, the 10th Irish Division come from Gallipoli, but then troops are coming from Alexandria, Marseille, and directly from some Southampton in the UK. And these journeys on troop ships, very cramped conditions, threats posed by U-boats. Got to remember that the Mediterranean, unlike the Atlantic and the Channel, remains a happy hunting ground for German and Austro-Hungarian U-boats throughout the war, right up until the really late days of the war. The Med is still not really under Allied control in terms of the submarine war. And they did arm a number of the warships and a number of the troop ships and transports. But this could prove something of a mixed blessing. And this is a quick quote from Second Lieutenant George Holderness, who was a cyclist officer, and he recalled this on his troop ship journey. He said, "Just after dawn on the second day out, the submarine alarm was sounded, and we all dashed to our stations. Frantic shouts for the gun crew brought forward the information that they'd been left behind in Port Said. A Serbian staff major and ex-gunner said he'd fire the gun, and he did so. The old boat groaned and creaked ominously. A second shell was fired nearer to the target this time, but it seemed to herald the end of the old cargo carrier, for she was so shaken that we feared she might split in two. The Serbian officer was urged not to do any more firing, and he quickly agreed. On this occasion, the suspect U-boat conning tower turned out to be an empty beer barrel." So, it's not all German U-boats or Austrian U-boats with Captain von Trapp on board. Sometimes it's just a bit of jetsam floating around in the Mediterranean. Because of the success of U-boats, by late 1917, they were looking to take a lot of the shipping out of the Med. So they needed a new way to get especially men wounded out of Salonika and reinforcements in. And what they did was they set up an overland route. It took a long time. What you would do, you'd get a train from Salonika to a little place called Bralo. That's to the south from Salonika. You'd then get on a lorry and go over the mountains of Thessaly to the Adriatic coast, a little place called Atea. And then from Atea, you would get a ship across to Taranto in Italy, and then you would get Italian and French trains up through Europe to the Channel ports, where you get a ship to the UK. So amazingly, a long way to go if you wanted to go home on leave, and many of the men didn't get home on leave at all. Now, Salonika itself was very different to the Greek city of today. It was very much an Eastern city. We have to remember that until 1912, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and it'd been in the Ottoman Empire for about 400 years. So it was very much a gateway to the East. So it would have been a sort of a fascinating place for many of these soldiers. So unless you were an old soldier who'd served in Egypt or India, this would have been a really, really difficult, a different place to actually see. So from the sea, Christopher Hughes of the 7th Wiltshire said, "Seen from the sea, Salonika was a lovely place, a fairy city with white minarets amongst the red roofs." And another soldier, Ivor Davis in the artillery, said it was absolutely Arabian Nights come to life, a picture unsurpassable. Well, that was from the sea, but when you actually landed, you saw some of the decay and chaos of the city. And Sergeant Ivan Morgan of the 11th Welsh recalled, "All this enchanting place was utterly destroyed at once when we set foot on the ground and marched from the dock to the base camp. But the place absolutely stank. If there was a stronger word, I'd use it." So it's very much a disheartening sort of place where these men actually ended up. Of course, there were many cafes and shops and establishments, and the wily traders of Salonika soon realised that they had a captive audience here, captive market, and prices went through the roof basically on anything. You could buy anything you liked in Salonika with any type of currency you wanted, but it would cost you pretty much an arm and a leg. The other thing is there was a real disconnect, an increasing disconnect between the men serving in the front line and the base area men, the men working on the lines of communications. And Christopher Hughes again said the following. He said, "At the base, they put the men onto building tennis courts and making palatial quarters for officers and men, and spend their nights in the cafes and theatre, giving the world at home the idea that this is a sort of life the Salonika army was leading, and gaining it the name of the Salonika picnic party." And there was, in fact, a music hall song in 1918 which jokingly said, "If you don't want to fight, go to Salonika." And a lot of Salonika men found out about this and said, "If I'm home and I find a bloke singing that, I'm going to basically lay him out because we are suffering out here." So it was a very much a problem. And because they couldn't send men home on leave very easily, in 1918 they started sending them back to Salonika to have leave in the base area. But unfortunately, in late 1917, August 1917, there is a Great Fire of Salonika, very much like the Great Fire of London. And it burns out the heart of the city, which does mean that when most of the other ranks got a chance to go back on leave, there wasn't that much to actually go and see. So you would probably end up in a rest camp. And you might find a cafe if you were lucky amongst the ruins of the city. So it really meant that most men were stuck up country, and because of that, the British Army has always been very good at boosting or maintaining the morale of its forces through various recreational activities. There were football, rugby, and cricket teams in brigade, divisional, and corps leagues. There were friendly matches played against international, overseas countries, so France, Italy, etc. Home internationals between English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish units. Athletics meets, horse shows, boxing tournaments were also very popular. But for those of a less sporting disposition, of course, there was lots of concert party opportunities, and pantomimes and musical reviews were held. And in fact, amongst them, there were 4 divisional level theatres located quite close behind the front lines, which enabled men coming out of the line on rest to go see a show and then go out on line so they could sort of forget about the war. And these were real morale boosts for the men, and the divisional commanders were really keen on this as a way to take men's minds off the fact they were just stuck in the wilds of Macedonia. Collinson Owen, the editor of the Balkan News, which was the BSF's newspaper, said, "To many thousands of men, these shows were the one link with the gaieties and comparatively carefree existence they'd known before the war. Night after night, these divisional shows were crowded with happy infantrymen who forgot entirely for the time being that they'd been away from home for 3 years or more. They were, in fact, one of the chief factors that enabled our men to keep their sanity after the long hardships, monotony, and sickness of the Balkan campaign." So, really, really important. Now, there were some other pastimes practiced in Salonika. Officers soon found that up country there was lots of wildfowl and options for fishing, etc. So officers sent home for their shotguns and fishing rods. The officers of the 1st King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry put together a makeshift pack of hounds and used to go hunting through the Struma Valley. The Bulgarians wouldn't shell them. The Bulgarians are very much into live and let live. So they would flush out whatever game they could find and chase it around in full view of the Bulgarians watching them. There was also some, obviously, field sports not using traditional equipment. So some men did use Lewis guns for wildfowling, saying it helped them practice shooting aeroplanes down. It's a good excuse for wasting ammunition potentially. And other people used Mills bombs and mortar rounds for fishing in the River Struma. And there was also tortoise racing. So men kept what they would do, you would have 2 or more tortoises. You would have a stick. You'd put the stick in the ground, draw a circle around the stick, have the tortoises facing the stick, and it was the first tortoise out of the ring that would win. And there was lots of betting going on during these races, and if you had a good racing tortoise, men would actually keep them and carry them around. And you can see here a soldier of the 7th Ox and Bucks with his tortoise in the trenches near Doiran. So that's some of the ways the men, if they could get out of the front line, used to spend their time. So what about actually campaigning? Well, for many, their first experience in Macedonia was participating in that conversion of Salonika into an entrenched camp. So building this line of defences. It began in December when the retreat back to Salonika happened, and it carried on until the end of March. So you've got about 4 months during the winter building these trenches. In total, the defence line ran for about 70 miles over these foothills north of Salonika, and it was consisted of a chain of mutually supporting strong points connected by communications trenches. There was a lavish use of barbed wire. Hundreds and hundreds of miles of barbed wire were put out. That gave it the nickname by British soldiers of the birdcage line, because they felt like they were wired into a cage. It was very hard work. It was done in the winter quite often. The soil, there isn't much soil. There's a lot of stones, a lot of rocks, very little in the way of explosives for blasting this. There was a shortage of engineering equipment and tools, and most of the men undertaking this work were living in bivouacs and bell tents up in the hills straight through a Macedonian winter. So pretty horrendous. But by April, May 1916, it was obvious that the Bulgarians were not going to invade Greece at this time. And we can't just keep men sitting 50, 60 miles away from where the enemy is. So we moved up country. So they start to move up country. And obviously this starts for the British in the summer, and it's bakingly hot. They're moving up country. Private George Vesey of the 8th Ox and Bucks remembered of his march. Marching is very hot and tiring, and we get a thirst on which no amount of drinking will satisfy. Our water bottles are very precious things. Our bottles are filled before moving off, and no man must drink until the order is given, although we get a longing to empty the bottle in one glorious drink. The watermen have difficulty in keeping up the supply, which has to be carried in leather packles on the backs of mules. So they march off, and they start off just living in their 2-man bivouacs. From the spring of 1917, as you could see from that map earlier, the BSF is holding a 90-mile front from the River Vardar round eastward to the mouth of the River Struma. And there are two main operational areas. The tangled mass of hills and ravines around Doiran. The terrain here lends itself to the construction of strong defensive positions, and as usual, the opposition have the higher ground. Same on the Western Front for the Germans. Here it's the Bulgarians, but exactly the same. And then the Struma Valley, where there's a large, flat, almost featureless plain stretching between two ranges of foothills between 5 and 12 miles apart. The static nature of the campaign soon meant that many of the old villages in the valleys and plains behind the front line became full of military encampments. There were corps and divisional headquarters, ammunition supply dumps, field hospitals, casualty clearing stations, RFC landing grounds, rest camps, specialist training schools later in the war, all jostling for space. Most of these villages had been evacuated during the Balkan Wars. Some of them were populated, and the British tended to move the locals out, and shepherds, etc., were given a pass so they could get into the defended zone. The French quite often left civilians in villages quite close to the front line, but we would normally send them away from the area. So that's what you would find sort of behind the lines. Many of the villages, of course, as I said, were depopulated and ruined to a large extent during the Balkan Wars. So there was nothing up country for the troops, sort of like estaminets, etc., in France. So again, most of the men were living up country in tented camps, if they were lucky. So if we look at the Doiran battlefield, here are some key points of the Doiran battlefield. The Bulgarians are holding all of these key positions. So the Grand Coronet in the background, it's about 1,800 feet high, and there's a big concrete observation post on there where the Bulgarians can see right down towards Salonika. So when the British are moving supplies up the railway lines, up the roads, the Bulgarians can see everything, count everything. It's very, very hard to have any element of surprise here. Pip Ridge along the back there, that's about 2,000 foot high. Each of those pips or peaks is defended by a wired-in redoubt with machine guns, trench mortars. There's one or two static flamethrowers up there as well. The Petit Coronet is the key position in the Bulgarian front line. It's right in the middle of the battlefield. The battlefield's about 3 miles by 3 miles. The British front line is on La Tortoise Hill. In between that is the Jumo Ravine, which is about 450 foot deep. And to get to the Bulgarians, you obviously have to scale that ravine. The Petit Coronet will be a key feature in both the main battles at Doiran, because if you do not pinch that hill out, anybody attacking either side of that hill will come under serious enfilade fire from Bulgarian machine guns on that position. So the capture, or the attempted capture, of that hill is always a vital objective. Now we can see this is the view back from the Grand Coronet. So you're looking back towards that front line. You can see the Jumo Ravine there cutting between La Tortue and Petit Coronet. So and you can see there the actual Bulgarian bunker, which is still there to this day. We had no guns that could knock this out. We literally spent 2.5 years chipping bits of concrete off the front of it, and you can still see a scree slope. Even though it's quite overgrown, there's still a scree slope in front of that position with bits of concrete and stone that were blown away by British artillery, but we could never knock it out. The other problem is, a bit like on the Italian front in the mountains, there's very little depth of soil. A foot, 1.5 foot, 2 foot if you're lucky. So you have to blast the trenches out of solid rock. Now the Bulgarians are in this position from December 1915 to about July, August 1916, whilst we're back in Salonika. So they have the ability to build defences 24/7 with nobody firing at them. It gives them a fantastic opportunity to do that. They're mentored by German engineers, so the latest engineering thinking for the Western Front is involved, and the whole place is honeycombed by bunkers. There's concrete bunkers everywhere, rock cut trenches, We have to remember, of course, that unlike on the Western Front, they had to emplace their artillery. Now, the reason for that is that there are very few alternative artillery positions. So on the Western Front, if you fired off your artillery, you'd get spotted, either flash spotting or sound ranging, or aeroplanes would spot you, and then you would quickly move your artillery battery before you got counter battery firing. Now, you don't have that option in Salonika, so you have to defend your guns by putting them under concrete construction. So the Bulgarians by 1917, and especially by 18, have got a complete range. They've got a range of bunkers. They've got artillery bunkers for everything: machine gun posts, observation posts, on position ammunition stores, and by 1918 a concrete bunker shelter for every soldier on that part of the front. So really well defended. The other thing is, we're not just fighting over difficult terrain and against really well positioned defences. We're also facing the Bulgarian 9th Pleven Division, which is Bulgaria's elite military formation. These men get to know their positions intimately and believe them to be impregnable. They have excellent infantry artillery cooperation, and their commanders, initially General Nerezov and then General Vazov, are exceptional commanders. They're brilliant. Not only are they very capable battlefield commanders, they're great man managers and morale boosting commanders. So by 1918, when the Bulgarian army is falling apart, the 9th Pleven Division is on full rations, got new uniforms, new boots, plenty of ammunition. How General Vazov and Nerezov did that, I've got no idea, but their morale was very high in 18, while the rest of the army was falling apart. Now, facing them, the British defences are not as extensive. Remember, as in France, we are not supposed to be sitting in these positions for good. We are supposed to be pushing the invader back. So the idea is we don't want the troops getting too comfortable, because their job is to go and seize the enemy positions. But in some places, such as Lator 2, we are very close to the Bulgarian front line, and we have to emplace things like artillery, etc. So we do use concrete bunkers and that where we actually need to. And we can see here, this is the typical view of the Devil's Eye bunker. You can see it up on the top there of Lator 2, and this on top of Grand Coronet, and this is the sort of terrain you have to actually get across. It's very difficult terrain to move across. Captain Stukely of the Ox and Bucks remembered, movement of a formed body across this ground was very difficult, and the maintenance of direction was far from being a simple matter. If the party did get safely across, it had to wriggle up a steep and rocky slope to reach the enemy wire. Consequently, it was very easy for a raid to misfire before it had reached its objective, and even if it was successful, the return journey was sure to be very unpleasant, owing to the Bulgar barrage, which was extremely well placed and generally unavoidable. So that's Doiran. So you've got French warfare here. Pretty, the lines are about 300, 400 yards apart. Very much snipers, trench mortars, bombardments, all going on. Not as intensive as in France, but intensive enough to be very unpleasant. Now, in total contrast to this is the Struma Valley. You can see here that wide open plain that is a totally different environment to fight in. It's a mixture of marshland, areas of thick scrub, and patchworks of abandoned farmlands surrounding abandoned villages. Initially, the River Struma, when the Bulgarians do come down into Greece, the Greeks don't do anything. This is sort of mid-1916. They do come down into the Struma. And the river, they don't cross the Struma. So the British are on one side, the Bulgarians on the other side. And for this time, there is active patrolling. And we patrol with a mixture of yeomanry cavalry and cyclists. Private Francis Ching remembered about these patrols. He said, our job was to patrol the villages and keep them free of Bulgarians. Sometimes they were down in front of us and laid traps for us. Sometimes we were there first and laid traps for them. But very seldom did they catch any of us, and very seldom did we catch any of them. they chased us as much as we chased them. It was fun in a way, I suppose. And you can see here the problem they had with abandoned standing maize crops. So when you're moving around in this, it's very difficult to move without making any noise, but it's also almost impossible to move around and keep sight of your own men. Potentially, it's a great ambush position as well. So very, very difficult patrolling and actually moving around. In September 16, we decided to start pushing the Bulgarians back across the valley into the foothills and to dominate no man's land. This is always the thing with the British Army in the First World War. The idea is to dominate no man's land, don't give the enemy any rest, keep them guessing, keep pushing them. And we start to do bite and hold operations where we target villages or groups of villages, and then we seize them and we wire them in to our defensive network. And you can see on the map here where the network actually comes across and takes some of these villages. And what we then end up with is a number of strong points. And these strong points, normally there would be 2 villages held by a battalion of infantry with machine gun support, a bit of artillery support, some engineers, medical section. The forward village would be almost a forward operating base from where patrols would go forward. If attacked, they would try to hold the forward village, but if not, they would fall back on the main village, and that would be held, and they could call in artillery strikes ahead of the village to actually keep that. And the idea was to hold that rear village as part of the defensive line. But the Struma is very quiet, because the Bulgarians are not at the same level as the 9th Pleven Division. Second Lieutenant Bundy, second King Zone, he'd been on the Somme in 1916. He comes out to Salonika, and this is his diary. So this is his diary, 21st of March 1918, the day the German offensive opens in France. This is the Struma Valley. Life is very uneventful. Every evening at 5, the Bulgars send over exactly 6 shells, but strangely enough, not onto our works, but onto a disused building about 200 yards to our rear. Our field battery behind usually replies with 6 shells, and nothing else happens for the day. The nights are so peaceful that the discharge of a single rifle after stand to brings inquiries from telephone from headquarters. So you can see it's very, very inactive. So they really had to work to keep the men active and in a sort of fighting spirit. So there's lots of little operations going out into the villages, patrols, etc., etc. Trench raids into villages is all really key here, and there's a lot of improvisation by small units, companies, platoons, etc., etc. Now, it is an agricultural area, so they could make trenches. So the trench systems here were very much like on the Western Front, obviously not as extensive, but they were proper, what we would call proper trenches. So there isn't much left to be seen now. Obviously, it's all been ploughed away, like in many of the areas in France. But we'll just have a little look at a couple of, we'll go back to Doiran, where the 2 main battles were fought. So this is April, May 1917 and September 1918. Major Nedev, he was on the 9th Division, Bulgarian Division staff, and he always said this. So this was about the mindset of the Bulgarian soldier at Doiran. He said, the soldiers were inspired with faith in the strength of the position and were told that they must fight to the last drop of their blood in order to check the enemy, to break his attack, and thus assure the future of Bulgaria. So this is really like Verdun for the Bulgarians. This is the place, though they shall not pass. We are defending Bulgaria. And they come up and they have to fight these 2 main battles here. The idea is the British are not trying to break through here. If we can, fantastic. But this is only about 18 kilometers from where the main Allied offensives are happening west of the Vardar River. French and Serbian forces with Italians, in 1917 some Russians as well, are trying to break through into the mountains. We want to hold these key Bulgarian foot troops to this front so they cannot reinforce what's happening to the west. But it does mean that British forces have to attack this very strong position. And this is a quick account from Private Francis Mullins of the 10th Devons, and he had to assault the position on Petit Coronet, and this is in 1917. As soon as it got dark, we moved out of our trenches and down one side of the hill to get into the lower end of the Jumeau ravine. But Johnny knew we were on the move and he knew our route, and he gave us the right pasting, and we soon had casualties. They seemed to know our every move. We got so far in the ravine and it was all hell let loose. Our lads were being knocked over like ninepins. We that were able got about halfway, but the noise of the explosions was terrific. Suddenly I found myself alone. We had to walk behind each other as it was not very wide in the ravine. My mates behind and in front were knocked out, and one poor chap was calling out for his mother. I was nearly choked by the cordite fumes, but I was unhurt, not even blown over. My bag of bombs was untouched. I had to go on. I picked my way over the bodies. I could see by the flash of the explosions. So they managed to get up onto this hill. But the problem is the Bulgarians have a standing barrage line in the ravine. So although the British are on the hill, getting reinforcements, ammunition resupply through the ravine is almost impossible because they have to go through this Bulgarian barrage. What the Bulgarians do very actively is they very quickly, if they lose a position, they hit it heavily with artillery and heavy trench mortars and then put in big counterattacks. And you've got to remember the Bulgarian soldiers here know this ground intimately. They know the dead ground and the approaches. So quite often the British would seize a position and the Bulgarians would pop up behind them using a ravine that they didn't know, that the British didn't know existed. So it's very, very difficult to actually hold on to these positions. And in fact, in both battles, it became almost impossible because the men became isolated fighting on these hills and just basically took too many casualties that they couldn't hold the position. To give you an impression of that, Chaplain Henry Day, he was down in the ravine in the attack in May 1917, and he went forward to the hill and he recalled the following. He said, about 10 o'clock, I thought I would see what was happening at the scene of the action, so I pushed onto the top of Petit Coronnet. There I witnessed an indescribably gruesome sight. Lying and sitting in all sides of positions were row upon row of dead and dying. Many were wounded. Many of the wounded were horribly mangled. Some were obviously insensible to pain, while others were suffering agonies. So that was 1917. We basically took very little ground in 1917, but we did tie down all of the Bulgarian troops from that part of the front. Nobody went the other side of the river. Now in 1918, they have to do this again. The Allies are going to do another Franco-Serbian offensive, and the British are having to attack at Doiran again. Now, obviously, many of the men having to do this in 1918 had done it in 1917. They had no illusion how difficult this was going to be, and they knew that the Bulgarians had used 1917 as a test of their defences and had improved the defences, ready for the next attack. Now, Major Christopher Hughes was on 77th Brigade staff by this time. He'd fought through the 1917 battle with the 7th Wiltshires. And in the early hours of 19 September 1918, he set out from brigade headquarters to check on the preparations of the Scottish battalions of the 77th Brigade staff. And this is from his diary. He said, "It was a very unpleasant walk. The Vladea ravine was being shelled by salvos of 5.9s, and it was thick with dust and smoke. After seeing the Argylls and the Fusiliers, I had to find the Scottish Rifles and discovered them assembling, ready to move out to attack, and saw Scougal, their commander. He held out his hand and said, 'Goodbye, Hughes, we shan't meet again.' He was killed leading his battalion very soon after. He was a splendid chap." And I think Scougal's mindset on that day is pretty typical of the men who had to get out of trenches and attack in 1918, because many of them must have thought, I got away with it in 1917. Am I going to get away with it again? Probably not. And if we look at those two battles of Doiran, so just 4 days action, the BSF suffered 35% of their battle casualties in just 4 days. Okay, that is only 8,179 men, but in terms of Salonika, that's a lot of men. The 7th Ox and Bucks, just to take one battalion, the 8th and 9th of May attack on Petit Coronnet was the most costly 24 hours of the whole war for that battalion. They went into action with 16 officers and 530 men and took as casualties 15 officers and 456 men. Other battalions on Pit Ridge in 1918, almost the whole of 66th Brigade were wiped out. They were taking 70% casualties in their attack as well. So that gives you an idea of the fighting. So let's look what else the men had to actually put up with. So they weren't fighting a high intensity warfare. They didn't have the ammunition, they didn't have the manpower, they didn't have the resources to fight like Haig was fighting on the Western Front. They would have run out of manpower and munitions. But they've got a very harsh environment to campaign in. So initially you've got summer. Summer is up to 112 Fahrenheit in the shade. Dress is shirt sleeves, shorts, and either slouch hats or sun helmets. The heat prevented anything being done really between 1600 hours. And if possible, the men would down tools, stop training, etc., get under shade, get into cover, and whole camps could appear to be totally deserted at that time. Private Charles Packer remembered, he said, a stranger strolling through our lines during his hours would probably not meet a soul, but he would hear snores coming from in some of the bivouacs. From others, he would hear low mutterings of satisfaction as some fellow, jackknife in hand, investigated the seam of his shirt in search of lice. Now, of course, the heat also brings plenty of insects and other lovely creepy crawlies. And Gunner Ivor Davis remembers this. He said, mosquitoes and flies were numerous and they made life at times a misery. Eating a biscuit and jam was a work of art. Unless one continuously waved a hand across the biscuit, it would be black with flies. If one placed an empty jam tin on the ground, it was immediately filled with flies, and the ants fought for their share too. Hundreds of large black beetles also put in an appearance, huge fellows, 3 or 4 inches long, with height and breadth to match. And of course, those staples of British Army rations, bully beef and bread, would also suffer in the heat. One veteran recalled, you could pour your bully out of the tin in a thick congealed mass, and it would be swarming with flies in the short journey from mess tin to mouth. And it was as well sometimes not to think too much of home when bread was being emptied from old sacks, which had been rubbing on the sides of perspiring mules for an hour or two on their journey up from the food dump. So not particularly pleasant when you had food, if you were really looking forward to it. Water is also in short supply. The Royal Engineers are kept very busy maintaining the water supply system across the northern part of northern Greece at this time, tapping into natural springs, laying pipelines, village fountains. One of the things the Turks did do for the locals, a network of village fountains, they are incorporated into the military system. But in the forward areas, men had to get their water from big central fuel tanks, normally located in ravines. And each night, the pack mule sections of the infantry battalions, etc., would move forward under cover of darkness, load up with the water from the designated water point, and take it back to the units. So that's the summer. Now the winter, totally the opposite. Absolutely freezing cold. 10th Irish Division, who were there in the winter of 1915, they get the worst conditions of the campaign. Their troops came from the island of Mudros, having been withdrawn from Gallipoli, and issues of winter clothing were incomplete. There were massive shortages. So many of the men went into the mountains of Serbia that winter without greatcoats, many of them wearing khaki drill uniforms, and it was pretty horrendous. Private William Knott, who was with the field ambulance, remembered the following. It is the coldest atmosphere I've ever experienced, and the infantry are piling in by the score. Poor fellows with frostbite and jaundice from the bleak perishing blizzard. They welcome the big roaring fires we keep on the go. I spent nearly all day dishing out mugs of cocoa, for as soon as one crowd had finished, another batch would come in. Some were absolutely helpless. Others had their overcoats frozen to them, while one man had an icicle dangling from his nose. And by December 1915, 23 officers, 1,663 men from 10th Irish Division have been invalided to hospitals in Salonika, suffering from frostbite and exhaustion, and that's before the Bulgarians attack them. The battalions are weak anyway, and they've lost a battalion and a half of men, basically to the winter weather before they're attacked. Pretty absolutely horrendous. And we have to remember that accommodation, as I've said, there are no in most of the area, there are no proper decent standing buildings. So the men live through winters in bivvies, bell tents. So it's pretty horrendous. Trenches clog up with snow. Um, it it was just really, really hard campaigning. Private Bernard Livermore, the second 20th London's remembered of this. He said, with amazing and surprising ferocity came the blizzard, sweeping across the featureless landscape. First mighty blasts of wind, bringing torrents of rain and stinging hailstones. Our bivvies collapsed and some of the sticks were broken. The gale increased, and the ferocious winds and wet. In the ferocious wind and wet, we endeavoured to repair the damage. To no avail, we just had to lie with the sodden sheets above our one blanket. Down in the Streamer Valley, they don't escape. The Streamer breaks its bank and floods, so most of the trenches and positions are flooded out. Second Lieutenant David Campbell, 6th Royal Irish Rifles, remembered the following near the village of Calendra in February 1917. The trenches were filled to their brims with water. The dugouts were filled to the roof. All we could do was to bivouac on the occasional patch of dry ground that appeared above the floods. The weather was bitterly cold. Next day we were issued thigh-length gumboots, and we began preparing a new line of defence. We were visible to the Bulgars, and they sent over a dozen shells, and we suffered a few casualties. By the third day, the men's feet were in pretty bad shape from the cold and dampness. It was impossible to dry anything. And of course, they've got a supply problem here. They don't really have many good roads. And the one good road they did have, the Streamer Valley, which went from Salonika down into the Ceres Road going into the Streamer Valley, was great, but it wasn't designed to have 3-ton lorries going up and down it almost every day of the year. And it just turns into a quagmire of mud. And the British Army and the French Army employs thousands of civilians whose job is basically to break up rocks and just to shovel that aggregate onto roads just to keep the road system actually useful. And at this time, we were really dependent on the mule. The mule is the unsung hero of this campaign. And if it wasn't for the mule with mule sledges and things, we wouldn't have been able to keep the army supplied, and we wouldn't have been able to keep the army mobile, especially up in the mountains. So it's absolutely vital. The other problem they've got is disease. It's a very old-fashioned campaign, this. Malaria is the worst of the diseases, but for the British Army alone, their non-battle casualties, 481,262 non-battle casualties. So that's 20 times the level of battle casualties. So this is an old-fashioned kind of campaign. This is like the 19th century for the British Army, where campaigning and disease is more of a threat than the enemy is. By 1917, the British Army has 50,000 beds ready for basically illness cases on the whole. That's a third of the size, almost a third of the size of the army as it was in 1918. And by the spring of 18, 29,000 of those beds are occupied by chronic malaria sufferers. Those are men who basically are of no use now to the army. They are not going to go back to the front line, but because of the U-boat problem, we can't get them out of theatre easily. We were sending lots of them to hospital on Malta and then back to the UK, but these guys are going to have to put up with that huge, long, overground transport route up through Italy and France to get home. Now, obviously, malaria only kills about 1% of those men it affects, but of course it saps people's strength, and it's recurrent as well. So you would have men who really spent most of their time going round and round the casualty evacuation chain. So going down with malaria, going down to the hospitals in Salonika, coming up through the convalescent camps, going back to their unit, and then a few days later going down with malaria again and going back round the chain. The area was a perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes, especially in the Streamer Valley. Very meandering streams, the very slow-moving Streamer, etc. Lots of reed beds. Great place for home for mosquitoes. So it became a massive problem. So in the summer months in the Streamer, they would pull out. So the Bulgarians would go back to the hills on one side, the British would pull back to the hills the other side, and no man's land would be the complete extent of the valley. we would abandon everything. We would actually take down all of those defensive systems that we built around the villages, ship all the materials back if we could, fill in the trenches, etc., move back into the hills. Then in the autumn, we would come back into the valley. We would go back, recapture all the villages and rebuild all the defences and start all over again. So that's what they were having to do. One thing they did do because General Milne had a real problem with manpower, keeping the troops and the defence lines properly up to strength, is he got permission from the War Office to form a brigade from garrison battalions. So these are men who are not normally going to serve in the front line. They are normally behind the lines, guarding prisoners, guarding depots, etc. But these battalions go into the front line, and it's the 228th Brigade, or they're nicknamed the 2 Late Brigade because they can't march very well. Christopher Hughes, he's now on the staff of 228th Brigade, and he said physically the brigade were in a terrible state. They were splendid crocks. Some were almost blind, some almost deaf, and the 22nd Rifle Brigade had more than 60 men over 60 years old. This impression is shared by the staff at the British Salonika Force Machine Gun School, who write in the War Diary in March 1917, whilst making allowance for the fact that the men were drawn from garrison battalions, the type of man sent down was very bad. The officers selecting them could have had very little knowledge of machine guns or imagination. One man had only one eye, and with that eye he could not see a 6 foot by 4 foot target at 25 foot. A man sent down for the Vickers gun had 2 stiff fingers on his right hand. Every time the gun fired, they were knocked by the crank handle. And a man sent down for Lewis gun was unable to lie in a prone position owing to an old injury. So perhaps you wouldn't think particularly useful troops, but there were quiet areas of the front, and the idea was you would put the 228th Brigade in to hold the line, which freed up troops for more active operations elsewhere. And because a lot of these men were old soldiers, they tended not to go down with diseases to the same extent as many of the new, more active troops. Now, they did have anti-malaria preparations. Quinine was taken. It was taken daily down in the Struma by men, 10 grains of quinine. You take it in powder form and then drink some water. The men didn't like taking it, so what they made them do was they would take the quinine powder, take a mouthful of water, and then they would be asked their name, rank, and number. So it was impossible for them to spit it out, and they had to swallow it. That was the one way they got round everybody taking it. However, it didn't really stop people going down with malaria. Still, thousands of men ended up getting it. There were shortages at some points of mosquito netting, but by 1718, that was good as well. Everybody was equipped with that. You also, for people on sentry duty, you had this lovely anti-malaria clothing. I'll give you a quick description of this by Second Lieutenant Richard Skilbeck Smith of the 1st Leinsters. He said, "Any stranger seeing a soldier dressed up in anti-mosquito garb would for the first time imagine himself face to face with a scarecrow. The face and arms are thoroughly smeared with an anti-mosquito preparation called paraquat. An excellent thing while it lasts, but it has a tendency to get absorbed into the skin after an hour or two, and one often had to smear on a second coating. The mosquitoes didn't like it though, and always kept very clear of a paraquat face. I can recommend it to any young lady worried by overzealous admirers." After this, shorts were turned down and tucked into the tops of the puttees to safeguard the knees. Thick gloves were worn attached by a piece of tape running through the arms and under the tunic over the back. Over the tin hat was worn a mosquito net veil, which, like the appearance of a beekeeper, rendered the face and neck immune from danger. They also had to put the men to work. A lot of this anti-mosquito work, sort of straightening out streams, getting rid of standing water, cutting reed beds down. If it was well behind the lines, they could use civilian labourers, but nearer the front, it had to be troops. So quite often, men coming out of the line for rest were pulled into doing all these sort of fatigues. So it was absolutely a hated job. And also, there was so much of this work to do that, to be honest, it didn't really eradicate the mosquito problem. And the British official history actually says this. It says the area was so vast that it was an impossible task to exterminate the mosquito in the short time, and probably no one imagined that more than a partial success could be attained. It is questionable, therefore, whether the measures employed reduce the mosquito incidence to such an extent as to justify the amount of labour expended. However, it probably gave the men a bit of a morale boost, at least, to think, well, we are doing something to try to get a handle on this. Luckily for the BSF, the end of the war comes very quickly at the end of September 1918, as the Bulgarian army collapses as the French and Serbians break through in the mountains west of the Vardar River. By this time, the not only is malaria hitting the forces, but influenza is hitting them as well. And really, the British especially it was very, very lucky that the Bulgarians collapsed so quickly, because had they been able to put up any sort of defence in the mountains, it would have been very difficult for the British to fight their way through and keep a pursuit going, suffering both from malignant malaria and the ravages of the influenza epidemic. So, in conclusion, when the Bulgarians collapse at the end of September 1918, it doesn't signal the end of active operations in the Balkans. Troops were required to occupy Bulgaria. They also had to see Romanian rule come back to an area called the Dobruja, which the Bulgarians had annexed during the war. Other units undertook an arduous cross-country trek towards the Turkish frontier to invade Turkey from Europe. They arrive just as Turkey surrenders, and then they march all the way back to Salonika again. Members of the BSF were also transferred into what was called the Army of the Black Sea. This initially some of these men go with Milne to occupy Constantinople. Then the Army of the Black Sea is supporting White Russians against Bolsheviks down in the Transcaucasia area, and many of the men do not get home until 1920. I'll use quotes by two of the soldiers there to summarise what it was like to be a soldier in Salonika, and it's very different from being a soldier in France. This first one is Richard Skilbeck-Smith of the Leinsters. The one outstanding memory which will always remain with me is the amount of campaigning we did in France as compared to the amount of trench warfare. The latter we had, of course, experienced in the Streamer Plain, but not in the sense known to those fighting in France. For with us, the nature of the ground was such that it would be very rare that we got within 500 yards of the enemy. But after periods in the line, the realities of campaigning became, as it were, second nature to us. We lived practically all our time in bivvies, in extremes of summer and winter weather, exposed to the elements, uncertain as to the next move, which might be anything over 10 kilometres through difficult country, equally uncertain as to when rations would arrive and whether they would be complete, and isolated from the outer world as regarded mail and information generally. And then Captain Nicholson, who's the adjutant of the 10th Hampshires, said, "Perhaps we didn't go into action as frequently as our troops did in France, but when we did, we used to have a good fill of it. Afterwards, we merely went back to a mosquito-ridden camp, or at best, a dusty camp in the foothills, where water in all probability was very scarce." So campaigning for 3 years in one of Europe's most unhealthy environments, with little support from the War Office, led to a general stagnation and decline of the BSF. But General Milne fought very hard to alleviate matters, especially with regard to the welfare of his soldiers. But very often the army had to rely on its own very inadequate resources. But out of this grew very strong bonds of comradeship, and they found expression in 1924 in the formation of the Salonika Reunion Association. Perhaps we can build a parallel here with the Burma veterans of the Second World War, as both sets of veterans believed they had fought in very much a forgotten campaign and never had received due recognition for their achievements. So I think it's fitting to conclude with the words of the Bishop of London, who wrote an open letter to the Times newspaper, which was published on the 8th of November 1918. And it's really an epitaph for the BSF, and it is the following. It says, "These men of our Eastern armies have the dust and toil without the laurel of the race to victory. I think that pretty much sums it up. Thank you very much.